Part 9 of Volume 3 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 3 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, translated by PlutarchPerrin. Nicias, Part 1. I think that Nicias is a suitable parallel to Crassus, and the Sicilian to the Parthian disaster. I must therefore at once, and in all modesty, entreat my readers not to imagine for an instant that, in my narration of what Thucydides has inimitably set forth, surpassing even himself in pathos, vividness, and variety, I am so disposed as was Timaeus. He, confidently hoping to excel Thucydides in skill, and make Philistus seem altogether tedious and clumsy, pushes his history along through the conflicts and sea fights and harangues which those writers had already handled with the greatest success, showing himself in rivalry with them, not even so much as by Lydian car a footman slowly plodding, to use Pindar's comparison, nay rather, a perfect example of senile learning and youthful conceit, and in the words of Diphilus, obese, stuffed to the full with Sicilian grease. Indeed, he often lapses unawares into the manner of Xenarchus, as, for instance, when he says he thinks that it was a bad omen for the Athenians that Nicias, whose name was derived from victory, declined at first to head their expedition; also that, by the mutilation of the Hermae, heaven indicated to them in advance that by the hands of Thermocratus the son of Hermon they were to suffer most of the reverses during the war; and further, that it was fitting that Heracles should aid the Syracusans, for the sake of their goddess Cora, who delivered Cerberus into his hands, but should be angry with the Athenians, because they were trying to succor the Egestaeans, although they were descendants of the Trojans, whose city he had once destroyed because of the wrong done him by Laomedon their king. As for Timaeus, he may possibly have been moved to write thus in the exercise of the same critical taste which led him to correct the language of Philistus and abuse Plato and Aristotle, but as for me, I feel that jealous rivalry with other writers in matters of diction is altogether undignified and pedantic, and if it be practised toward what is beyond all imitation, utterly silly. At all events, those deeds which Thucydides and Philistus have set forth, since I cannot entirely pass them by, indicating as they do the nature of my hero and the disposition which lay hidden beneath his many great sufferings, I have run over briefly, and with no unnecessary detail, in order to escape the reputation of utter carelessness and sloth; but those details which have escaped most writers, and which others have mentioned casually, or which are found on ancient votive offerings or in public decrees, these I have tried to collect, not massing together useless material of research, but handing on such as furthers the appreciation of character and temperament. Accordingly, I may say of Nicias, in the first place, what Aristotle wrote, namely, that the three best citizens of Athens, men of hereditary goodwill and friendship for the people, were Nicias the son of Niceratus, Thucydides the son of Milesius, and Theramenes the son of Hagnon. However, this was true of the last in lesser degree than of the other two, because he has been flouted for inferior parentage as an alien from Ceos, and on account of his not being steadfast, but ever trying to court both sides in his political career, was nicknamed Cothurnus. Of the other two, Thucydides was the older man, and as head of the aristocratic party, the party of the good and true, often opposed Pericles in his efforts to win the favour of the people. Nicias was a younger man. He was held in some repute even while Pericles was still living, so that he was not only associated with him as general, but frequently had independent command himself. After Pericles was dead, Nicias was at once put forward into the position of leader, especially by the party of the rich and notable. These made him their champion to face the disgusting boldness of Cleon. And yet, for that matter, the common people also held him in favour and aided his ambitions. For although Cleon had great influence with them, by coddling them and giving frequent jobs for pay, yet the very men whose favour he thus sought to gain were aware of his rapacity and fierce effrontery, and for the most part preferred Nicias as their champion. The dignity of Nicias was not of the harsh, offensive sort, but was blended with much circumspection, and won control of the people from the very fact that he was thought to be afraid of them. Timid as he was by nature and distrustful of success, in war he managed to succeed in hiding his cowardice under a cloak of good fortune, for he was uniformly successful as a general; while in political life, his nervousness, and the ease with which he could be put into confusion by accusers, actually tended to make him popular, and gave him in a high degree that power which comes from the favor of the people, because they fear men who scorn them, but exalt men who fear them. The multitude can have no greater honor shown them by their superiors than not to be despised. Now Pericles led the city by virtue of his native excellence and powerful eloquence, and had no need to assume any persuasive mannerisms with the multitude. But Nicias, since he lacked such powers, but had excessive wealth, sought by means of this to win the leadership of the people. And since he despaired of his ability to vie successfully with the versatile buffoonery by which Cleon catered to the pleasure of the Athenians, he tried to captivate the people by choral and gymnastic exhibitions, and other like prodigalities, outdoing in the costliness and elegance of these all his predecessors and contemporaries. Of his dedicatory offerings there remains standing in my day not only the Palladium on the Acropolis, the one which has lost its gilding, but also the temple surmounted by corrugate tripods, in the precinct of Dionysus. For he was often victorious with choruses, and was never defeated. A story is told, how, in one of his choral exhibitions, a house servant of his appeared in the costume of Dionysus, very fair to see, and very tall, the down of youth still upon his face. The Athenians were delighted at the sight, and applauded for a long time. At last Nicias arose and said he deemed it an unholy thing that one who had been acclaimed as a god should be a slave, and gave the youth his freedom. It is a matter of record also how splendid and worthy of the god his lavish outlays at Delos were. The choirs which cities used to send thither to sing the praises of the god were wont to put in at the island in haphazard fashion. The throng of worshippers would meet them at the ship and bid them sing, not with the decorum due, but as they were hastily and tumultuously disembarking, and while they were actually donning their chaplets and vestments. But when Nicias conducted the festal embassy, he landed first on the neighbouring island of Rhenea, with his choir, sacrificial victims, and other equipment. Then, with the bridge of boats which he had brought along to him from Athens, where it had been made to measure and signally adorned with gildings and dyed stuffs and garlands and tapestries, he spanned during the night the strait between Rhenea and Delos, which is not wide. At break of day he led his festal procession in honour of the god, and his choir arrayed in lavish splendour and singing as it marched, across the bridge to land. After the sacrifices and choral contest and the banquets were over, he erected the famous bronze palm tree as a thank offering to the god, and consecrated to his service a tract of land which he bought at the price of 10,000 drachmas, the revenues from which the Dehens were to expend in sacrificial banquets, at which many blessings should be invoked upon Nicias from the gods. This stipulation he actually had graven on the stone which he left in Delos to be, as it were, the sentry over his benefaction. The palm tree, however, was torn away by the wind and fell against the colossal statue of the god, which the Naxians erected, and overturned it. In this course it is clear that there was much ostentatious publicity, looking towards increase of reputation and gratification of ambition, and yet to judge from the rest of the man's bent and character, one might feel sure that such means of winning the favour and control of the people were rather a corollary to his reverent piety. For he was one of those who are excessively terrified at heavenly portents, and was addicted to divination, as Thucydides says. And in one of the dialogues of Pasiphon it is recorded that he sacrificed every day to the gods, and that he kept a diviner at his house, ostensibly for the constant inquiries which he made about public affairs, whereas most of his inquiries were really about his own private matters, and especially about his silver mines, for he had large interests in the mining district of Laurium, and they were exceedingly profitable, although worked at great risks. He maintained a multitude of slaves in these mines, and the most of his substance was in silver. For this reason he had a large retinue of people who wanted his money, and who got it too, for he gave to those who could work him harm no less than to those who deserved his favours, and in general his cowardice was a source of revenue to the base, as his liberality was to the good. Witness to this can be had from the comic poets. Telecleides composed the following verses on a certain public informer: "So then Charnicles gave a mina that he might not tell of him, how he was his mother's firstborn, and her purse-born child at that. -4 he got from Nicias, son of rich Niceratus. But the reason why he gave them, though I know it very well, I'll not tell, the man's my friend, and I think him wise and true." and the personage who was held up to ridicule by Eupolis in his Maricus fetches in a sort of lazy popper, and says: Maricus. How long a time since you were now with Nicias? Popper. I have not seen him, saving just now on the square. Maricus. The man admits he actually did see Nicias; yet what possessed him thus to see him if he was not treacherous? Chorus. Ye heard, my comrades, oh! Our Nicias was taken in the very act. Popper. What, you, O crazy witted folk! You catch a man so good in sin of any sort? And the Cleon of Aristophanes blusteringly says: I'll bellow down the orators, and Nicias I'll rattle. And Phrynichus plainly hints at his lack of courage and his panic-stricken air in these verses: He was a right good citizen, and I know it well. He wouldn't cringe and creep as Nicias always does. Since he was disposed to be thus cautious of public informers, he would neither dine with a fellow citizen, nor indulge in genial interchange of views or familiar social intercourse. Indeed, he had no leisure for such pastimes; but when he was general, he remained at the war department till night, and when he was counsellor, he was first to reach and last to leave the council. And even if he had no public business to transact, he was inaccessible and hard to come at, keeping close at home with his doors bolted. His friends used to accost those who were in waiting at his door and beg them to be indulgent with Nicias, for he was even then engaged upon sundry urgent matters of public business. The man who most aided him in playing this rôle, and helped him to assume his costume of pompous dignity, was Hero. He had been reared in the household of Nicias, and thoroughly instructed by him in letters and literature. He pretended to be the son of Dionysius, surnamed Chalcas, whose poems are indeed extant, and who, as leader of the colonizing expedition to Italy, founded Therivi. This Hero it was who managed for Nicias his secret dealings with the seers, and who was for ever putting forth among the people moving tales about the life of severe hardships which his patron led for the sake of the city. "Why," said he, "even when he takes his bath and when he eats his dinner, some public business or other is sure to confront him. He neglects his private interests in his anxiety for the common good, and scarcely gets to sleep till others wake. That's the reason why he is physically all run down, and is not affable or pleasant to his friends; nay, he has actually lost these too, in addition to his substance, and all in the service of the city. Other public men not only win friends but enrich themselves through their influence as public speakers, and then fare sumptuously, and make a plaything of the service of the city." In point of fact, such was the life of Nicias that he could say of himself what Agamemnon did: "Sooth, as master of my life, my pomp I have, and to the populace I'm a slave." He saw that the people, upon occasion, served their own turn with experienced men of eloquence or surpassing ability, but ever looked with suspicious and cautious eyes upon such powers, and tried to abate the pride and reputation to which they gave rise. This was manifest in their fining Pericles and ostracizing Damon, and discrediting, as most of them did, Antiphon of Rhamnusian, and finally, above all, in the fate of Pacis, the captor of Lesbos, who, while he was giving the official account of his generalship, drew his sword in the very court room and slew himself. Nicias therefore tried to evade commands which were likely to be laborious and long, and whenever he did serve as general made safety his chief aim, and so was successful for the most part, as was natural. He did not, however, ascribe his achievements to any wisdom or ability or valour of his own, but rather credited them to fortune, and took modest refuge in the divine ordering of events, relinquishing thereby part of his reputation through fear of envy. Events bore witness to his wisdom, for in the many great reverses which the city suffered at that period he had absolutely no share. It was under the leadership of Calliades and Xenophon that his countrymen met defeat at the hands of the Chalcidians in Thrace. The Aetolian disaster occurred when Demosthenes was in command. Hippocrates was general when 1,000 citizens were sacrificed at Delium, and for the plague Pericles incurred the most blame, because he shut up the throng from the country and the city on account of the war, and the plague was the result of their changing of abode and their unwonted manner of living. For all these things Nicias was free from blame, while as general he captured Cythera, an island favourably situated for the command of Laconia and inhabited by the Lacedaemonians. He captured also many places in Thrace, which had revolted, and brought them back to their allegiance. Having shut up the Megarians in their city, he straightway seized the island of Minoa, and shortly after, from this base of operations, got possession of Nicaea. He also made a descent upon the territory of Corinth, defeated the Corinthians in battle and slew many of them, including Lycophron their general. Here it befell him, when his dead were taken up for burial, that two of his men were left unnoticed on the field. As soon as he was made aware of this, he halted his armament and sent back a herald to the enemy asking leave to take up his dead. And yet by usage and unwritten law the side which secured the right to take up its dead by a truce was thought to renounce all claims to victory, and for those who so obtained this right, the erection of a trophy of victory was unlawful, since they are victors who possess the field, but petitioners do not possess the field, since they cannot take what they want. Notwithstanding this, Nicias endured rather to abandon the honor and reputation of his victory than to leave unburied two of his fellow citizens. He also ravaged the coast of Laconia, routed the Lacedaemonians who opposed him, captured Thyrea, which the Aeginetans held, and took his prisoners alive off to Athens. After Demosthenes had fortified Pylos, the Peloponnesians came up against it by land and sea, a battle was fought, and about 400 Spartans were shut off on the island of Sphacteria. Then the Athenians considered that their capture would be a great achievement, as was true. But the siege was difficult and toilsome, since the region afforded little fresh water. Even in summer the shipping of the necessary supplies round Peloponnesus was a long and expensive process, while in winter it was sure to be perilous if not altogether impossible. The Athenians were therefore in bad humour, and repented them of having repulsed an embassy of the Lacedaemonians, which had come to treat with them for a truce and peace. They had repulsed it because Cleon, chiefly on account of Nicias, was opposed to it. For he hated Nicias, and when he saw him zealously co operating with the Lacedaemonians, persuaded the people to reject the truce. So when the siege grew longer and longer, and they learned that their forces were in terrible straits, they were angry with Cleon. He, however, laid all the blame on Nicias, and denounced him, saying that it was through cowardice and weakness that he was letting the men on the island slip through his hands, whereas, had he himself been general instead of Nicias, they would not have held out so long. Thereupon it occurred to the Athenians to say, "It's not too late. Why don't you sail yourself and fetch the men?" Nicias too rose in the assembly and resigned his command of the expedition to Pylos in favour of Cleon, bidding him take as large a force as he wished, and not to vent his boldness in mere words which brought no peril with them, but to perform some deed for the city which would be worth its notice. At first Cleon tried to draw back, confused by the unexpectedness of this offer, but the Athenians kept up the same cries of encouragement, and Nicias kept taunting him, until, his ambition incited and on fire, he undertook the command, and besides, declared in so many words that within 20 days after sailing he would either slay the men on the island or bring them alive to Athens. The Athenians were moved to hearty laughter at this, rather than to belief in it, for they were already in the way of treating his mad vanity as a joke, and a pleasant one too. It is said, for instance, that once, when the assembly was in session, the people sat out on the Pnyx a long while waiting for him to address them, and that late in the day he came in all garlanded for dinner and asked them to adjourn the assembly to the morrow. "I'm busy to day," he said. "I'm going to entertain some guests, and have already sacrificed to the gods." The Athenians burst out laughing, then rose up and dissolved the assembly. However, this time he had good fortune, served his general most successfully along with Demosthenes, and within the time which he had specified brought home as prisoners of war, their arms surrendered, all the Spartans on Sphacteria who had not fallen in battle. This success of Cleon's brought great discredit on Nicias. He was thought not merely to have cast away his shield, but to have done something far more disgraceful and base in voluntarily throwing up his command out of cowardice, and in abandoning to his enemy the opportunity for so great a success, actually voting himself out of office. For this Aristophanes again scoffs at him and his birds in words like these: "And lo, by Zeus, we can no longer doze about, we have no time, nor shilly-shally Niciasize," and in his Farmers, where he writes, "Thigh, and running about while speaking," he thus imbued the managers of the city's policies with that levity and contempt for propriety which soon after confounded the whole state. Just about that time Alcibiades was beginning to be a power at Athens. For a popular leader he was not so unmixed in evil as Cleon. The soil of Egypt, it is said, by reason of its very excellence, produces alike drugs of which many are good, intermixed, but many are deadly. In like manner the nature of Alcibiades, setting as it did with full and strong currents towards both good and evil, furnished cause and beginning for serious invocations. And so it came to pass that even after Nicias was rid of Cleon, he did not get opportunity to lull the city into perfect rest and calm, but when he had actually set the state fairly in the path of safety, was hurled from it by an impetuous onset of Alcibiades' ambition, and plunged again into war. This was the way it came about. The men most hostile to the peace of Hellas were Cleon and Brasidas. Of these, war covered up the baseness of the one and adorned the excellence of the other; that is to say, it gave the one opportunities for great iniquities, the other for great achievements. After these men had both fallen in one and the same battle before Amphipolis, Nicias found at once that the Spartans had long been eager for peace, and that the Athenians were no longer in good heart for the war; that both were, so to speak, unstrung, and glad to let their arms drop to their sides. He therefore strove to unite the two cities in friendship, and to free the rest of the Hellenes from ills, as well as to give himself a season of rest, and so to make secure for all coming time the name which he had for success. The men who were well to do, and the elderly men, and most of the farmers, he found inclined to peace from the first, and after he had talked privately with many of the rest, taught them his views and blunted the edge of their desire for war. Then he at once held out hopes to the Spartans, and urgently invited them to seek for peace. They had confidence in him, not only because of his usual fairness towards them, but especially because he had shown kind attentions to those of their men who had been captured at Pylos, and kept in prison at Athens, had treated them humanely, and so eased their misfortune. The two parties had before this made a sort of stay of mutual hostilities for a year, and during this time they had held conferences with one another, and tasted again the sweets of security and leisure and intercourse with friends at home and abroad, so that they yearned for that old life which was undefiled by war, and listened gladly when choirs sang such strains as "Let my spear lie unused for the spider to cover with webs," and gladly called to mind the saying, "In peace the sleeper is waked not by the trumpet, but by the cock." Accordingly, they heaped abuse on those who said that the war was fated to last thrice 9 years, and then in this spirit debated the whole issue and made peace. Most men held it to be a manifest release from ills, and Nicias was in every mouth. They said he was a man beloved of God, and that heaven had bestowed on him, for his reverent piety, the privilege of giving his name to the greatest and fairest of blessings. They really thought that the peace was the work of Nicias, as the war had been that of Pericles. The one, on slight occasion, was thought to have plunged the Hellenes into great calamities; the other had persuaded them to forget the greatest injuries and become friends. Therefore to this day men call that peace the peace of Nicias. End of Nicias Part 1.